If a stranger suddenly called you her husband in front of 200 people, would you play along or walk away? That question never would have crossed my mind until the morning I boarded Flight 482 from Seattle to New York with nothing more exciting on my schedule than a business presentation and an overpriced airport sandwich. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 32 years old, and I have always believed the safest trips are the boring ones. I checked my watch, adjusted the strap of my carry-on, and found my seat near the middle of the cabin. The familiar scent of brewed coffee drifted through the aisle while passengers argued softly over overhead bin space, and children pressed their faces against the windows, fascinated by airplanes that looked identical to the one we were sitting in. I slipped my phone into airplane mode before the announcement even reminded us to do it. My plan was simple: read a few reports, catch a nap, land at JFK, survive the meeting, and fly home 2 days later. Life was predictable, and I liked it that way. Then someone stopped beside my row. I glanced up expecting another traveler searching for a seat number, but instead I found a woman standing perfectly still, one hand gripping the handle of a Navy suitcase, while the other held her boarding pass so tightly the paper had begun to wrinkle. She looked to be around my age, dressed in a light beige coat despite the warm cabin, with chestnut hair pulled into a loose ponytail that looked as though she had fixed it in a hurry. Her eyes moved across my face with an intensity that made me instinctively wonder if we had met before. I was almost certain we hadn't. She looked down at her ticket, then at the seat beside me. 12A. Without saying a word, she slid into the window seat and let out the quietest sigh I had ever heard, like someone finally reaching shelter after standing in the rain. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I returned my attention to the safety card, pretending not to notice that she kept glancing toward the front of the aircraft every few moments. Her knee bounced once, then stopped. She checked the aisle again. Whatever she was waiting for, it wasn't the flight attendant offering complimentary water. The cabin door remained open as the last passengers hurried aboard. A businessman squeezed past us with an apologetic smile. An elderly couple laughed over whose turn it was to hold the travel pillow. Everything felt perfectly ordinary except for the woman beside me, whose breathing seemed just a little too careful, as if she were rehearsing something in her mind. I considered asking whether she was afraid of flying, but before I could say anything, 3 well-dressed men stepped into the cabin together. They weren't loud or threatening. They simply paused near the entrance and slowly looked from row to row, scanning faces with calm, deliberate patience. The woman beside me stiffened almost imperceptibly. Her fingers curled around the armrest. Then, without warning, she turned toward me, placed her hand gently over mine, smiled with astonishing warmth, and whispered just loudly enough for the nearest passengers to hear, "Honey, there you are." I was starting to think my husband had forgotten me. My brain completely stalled. I looked at the woman beside me, then at our joined hands, convinced I had somehow missed an important chapter of my own life. She squeezed my fingers ever so slightly, not painfully, but with unmistakable urgency. Her smile never wavered. It was warm enough to fool anyone watching, yet her eyes carried a silent plea that only I could see. Before I could ask what was happening, one of the 3 men began walking slowly down the aisle, glancing from seat to seat with the casual confidence of someone who believed he belonged wherever he happened to be. The flight attendants welcomed passengers with practiced smiles, apparently noticing nothing unusual. Around us, people were settling into their seats, fastening seat belts, lifting backpacks beneath the seats in front of them, completely unaware that my morning had taken a sharp turn into something I could not explain. The woman leaned closer until only I could hear her. "Please, just for a little while. I promise I will explain later." Her voice was calm, almost steady, but there was a faint tremble hiding beneath every word. I should have pulled my hand away. I should have demanded answers. Instead, curiosity rooted me in place. Maybe it was because she looked genuinely frightened without appearing dramatic. Maybe it was because every instinct told me she was asking for help rather than trying to deceive me. The nearest of the 3 men stopped 2 rows ahead and quietly asked another passenger something I could not hear. He nodded politely before continuing farther down the cabin. My pulse suddenly felt much louder than the engines outside. The woman rested her head lightly against my shoulder for just a second, a gesture so natural that an older woman across the aisle smiled at us with obvious approval. "Young love," she whispered to her husband, who chuckled without looking up from his magazine. I almost laughed from the sheer absurdity of it. If they only knew. The boarding door finally closed with a heavy mechanical sound, followed by the familiar safety announcement. Relief briefly crossed the woman's face, but it disappeared almost as quickly when one of the men paused beside our row. He looked directly at her before shifting his attention toward me. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Have either of you happened to see a woman traveling alone, wearing a beige coat?" Every muscle in my body tightened. Before I could accidentally say something foolish, the woman answered with effortless confidence. "I have been sitting with my husband since we boarded," she replied, giving my hand another reassuring squeeze. I do not think I noticed anyone matching that description. The man studied us for another long second. I forced myself to meet his eyes without looking nervous, silently praying that my face was a better actor than I was. Finally, he offered a courteous smile. "Thank you. Sorry to bother you. Enjoy your flight." He continued toward the rear of the aircraft. Only after he disappeared behind the last row did I realize I had been holding my breath. The engines grew louder as the airplane slowly backed away from the gate. The woman released my hand, folded both of hers neatly in her lap, and stared out the window, as if nothing unusual had happened. I waited several seconds before speaking. "I think you owe me at least one explanation." She closed her eyes briefly and nodded. "You deserve several. But until we are in the air, the fewer words we exchange, the safer it is for both of us." That answer only created more questions. Outside the window, the runway stretched endlessly beneath a gray northwest sky. And for the first time in my life, I found myself hoping a flight would take off as quickly as possible, because somehow being 30,000 feet above the ground suddenly felt safer than sitting still on it. The aircraft gathered speed, pressing me gently into my seat as the runway blurred into streaks of gray beneath the windows. A few seconds later, the wheels lifted free of the ground, and a quiet ripple of relief moved through the cabin as though everyone had silently agreed that the hardest part of the journey was over. Beside me, the woman finally exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding since she first sat down. The city shrank beneath scattered clouds, and once the seat belt sign remained illuminated for the climb, she slowly turned toward me. "Thank you," she said softly. "I know I asked a lot from someone I have never met." I folded my arms and studied her face. Up close, she looked less mysterious than exhausted. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, and despite the composed smile she kept offering, she seemed like someone who had not enjoyed a full night of sleep in quite some time. "You are right," I replied. "You asked a lot. You also involved me in something without giving me any choice." She lowered her eyes. "I know. I am sorry." For a moment, we simply listened to the steady hum of the engines. Around us, laptops opened, headphones appeared, and a little boy across the aisle proudly announced that he could already see tiny rivers below. Ordinary life had returned to the cabin, making the last 15 minutes feel almost impossible. "Can you at least tell me your name?" I asked. She hesitated for only a heartbeat. "Claire." "Claire what?" A faint smile crossed her lips. "One question at a time." I could not help smiling back despite myself. "Fair enough. I am Ethan." "I know," she answered quietly. "I heard the gate agent greet you before boarding. That caught me off guard." She noticed my expression and quickly added, "That is the only thing I know about you. I promise." Before I could respond, the flight attendant rolled the beverage cart into our section. She greeted us with cheerful professionalism. "Good morning. Can I get you two something to drink?" Claire looked at me for the briefest moment before answering. "He always orders coffee first." I blinked. The flight attendant laughed warmly. "Someone knows her husband well." I almost corrected her, but Claire's hopeful glance stopped me. "Black coffee," I said instead. "And apple juice for me," Claire added. "Thank you." The flight attendant handed us our drinks with a knowing smile. "You two make a very sweet couple." After she moved on, I shook my head in disbelief. "You seem surprisingly comfortable pretending." Claire stared into the cup of juice resting in her hands. "Sometimes pretending is easier than explaining." Her answer lingered in my mind longer than I expected. A few minutes later, the captain announced that we had reached cruising altitude and could move about the cabin. Several passengers stood to stretch. One of the three men walked slowly toward the restroom near the front, his eyes casually drifting across each row as he passed. Claire did not look at him. She simply reached across the armrest and gently slipped her hand through mine again. There was no panic in the gesture this time, only quiet consistency, as though she understood that believable stories lived in small details rather than dramatic performances. The man glanced at us for less than a second before continuing forward without slowing his pace. When he disappeared behind the curtains separating the cabins, Claire released my hand once more. "Thank you," she whispered again. "You are a better actor than you think." I let out a quiet laugh. "That makes one of us." She smiled for the first time without forcing it, and in that brief, genuine expression, I realized something unexpected. Whatever secret Claire was carrying, it was not the kind that made her dangerous. It was the kind that had made her incredibly lonely. The strange rhythm of our pretend. Marriage settled into something unexpectedly believable over the next hour. It was not because either of us was a gifted performer. It was because ordinary life kept handing us little moments that demanded ordinary answers. A flight attendant stopped beside our row carrying a basket of warm cookies fresh from the galley. "One for you, sir, and one for your wife," she said with a bright smile. Claire accepted hers before I had time to react. "Thank you," she replied naturally. "He will probably steal half of mine anyway." The attendant laughed. "That sounds exactly like my husband." She continued down the aisle, leaving me staring at Claire in disbelief. "I have never stolen your cookies," I whispered. Claire broke off a small piece and handed it to me with a playful smile. "You just did." I could not help laughing as I accepted it. Somehow that simple exchange eased the tension that had been sitting between us since takeoff. A few rows ahead, the little boy who had been fascinated by the clouds wandered toward us with his mother following close behind. He looked at Claire and then at me with complete seriousness. "Are you two married for real?" he asked. His mother immediately apologized, her face turning pink. "I am so sorry. He asks everyone questions." Claire smiled kindly. "It is all right." She looked at me for the briefest moment before answering. "Yes, we are." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "My grandma says married people always smile at each other like you do." He seemed satisfied with that observation and skipped back toward his seat before either of us could respond. Claire's smile faded into something quieter. "Children notice everything," she murmured. "Apparently they do," I replied. I caught myself wondering how convincing we really looked from the outside. To everyone else, we were simply another couple sharing a cross-country flight. Only we knew that less than 2 hours earlier we had been complete strangers. The captain announced that light turbulence was expected ahead, asking everyone to return to their seats. The airplane began to sway gently through a patch of uneven air, causing drinks to ripple inside plastic cups. Claire instinctively reached for the armrest, then stopped herself. Without thinking very much about it, I rested my hand nearby. She looked at me, surprised. "You do not have to keep pretending when nobody is watching," she said softly. "Maybe I am not pretending anymore," I answered before realizing how strange that sounded. Her expression softened, but she did not reply. Instead, she looked out the window where endless white clouds stretched across the horizon like fresh snow. After a few quiet minutes, she finally spoke again. "Do you know what the hardest part of lying is?" I shook my head, remembering which version of yourself everyone believes. There was no humor in her voice this time, only exhaustion. Before I could ask what she meant, movement near the front of the cabin caught my attention. One of the 3 men had returned from the restroom, but had not gone back to his seat. Instead, he stood speaking quietly with another passenger while occasionally glancing in our direction. It was subtle enough that most people would never notice. Claire noticed immediately. She kept her eyes fixed on the window, yet I saw her shoulders become slightly tense. Whatever story had brought her onto this airplane was clearly not over. In fact, I had the growing feeling that the real journey had only just begun. The man remained near the front of the cabin far longer than seemed necessary. He was not staring openly, and that was exactly what made it unsettling. Every few moments he would glance in our direction before returning to his conversation or pretending to study the seat map posted near the galley. Most passengers would never have noticed. I only noticed because Claire had taught me, without saying a word, that small details mattered. "He has been watching us since boarding," I whispered. Claire kept her eyes on the clouds drifting beyond the window. "Yes." It was the first completely honest answer she had given me since we met. "Do you know him?" I asked. Her silence lasted several seconds. "I know what he represents." That answer settled heavily between us. It explained nothing, Yet somehow it explained enough to convince me this was far more complicated than an awkward misunderstanding. The seatbelt sign chimed on again as the airplane crossed another pocket of uneven air. Coffee trembled inside paper cups, overhead bins rattled softly, and a nervous laugh echoed from somewhere behind us. Claire inhaled slowly, closing her eyes for just a moment before opening them again. "You are wondering why I picked you," she said quietly. "I have been wondering that since you called me your husband." She nodded once. "Because you looked kind." I blinked. "That is your explanation? You were helping an older gentleman lift his suitcase before boarding. You thanked every airport employee who spoke to you. You smiled at a little girl after she accidentally bumped into your shoulder. Most people do not notice those things. I do." I looked down at my hands, suddenly embarrassed by compliments I did not know how to accept. "Kindness is not exactly a survival skill." "Sometimes it is," Claire replied. Before I could ask another question, the elderly couple across the aisle leaned toward us. The husband held up a phone with a cheerful grin. "Would you two mind taking our picture? We are celebrating 40 years together today." Claire accepted the phone before I even reached for it. She stood carefully in the aisle, framed the shot, and laughed softly as the couple insisted on holding hands exactly the way they had at their wedding decades earlier. When she handed the phone back, the woman smiled warmly. "Now it is your turn." Claire froze. "Our turn. A young couple should always have pictures together when they travel," the older woman said. Before either of us could politely refuse, she had already lifted her phone. Claire looked at me with obvious uncertainty. I gave the smallest shrug I could manage. One harmless photograph could not possibly matter. We stood shoulder to shoulder in the narrow aisle while the woman counted to 3. Claire smiled naturally. I managed something that probably resembled a smile. The camera clicked twice. "Perfect," the woman announced happily. "Someday you will be glad you kept that memory." We thanked them and returned to our seats. Claire stared quietly at the window for several moments before speaking. "It is strange." "What is?" "That the first picture of us together might be the only honest thing about today." Her words lingered in my mind long after she fell silent. Across the cabin, the watchful man finally returned to his seat, but instead of feeling relieved, I noticed something else. Another passenger near the rear had begun looking our way with the same calm, deliberate attention. Whether they knew each other or not, I could not tell. What I did know was that whatever Claire had hoped would end once the airplane left the ground had followed us into the sky. And for the first time since this unbelievable journey began, I realized that simply landing in New York might not be enough to leave it behind. For several long minutes, neither of us spoke. The engines maintained their steady hum while sunlight spilled across the tops of endless clouds, making the world outside look peaceful enough to belong in a postcard. Inside seat 12A, however, peace felt impossibly far away. Claire folded and unfolded the paper napkin from her drink with slow, careful movements, as though she were deciding whether I had earned the truth. Finally, she looked at me. "You have every reason to stop helping me," she said quietly. "If you want to spend the rest of this flight pretending we never spoke, I will understand." I shook my head before she finished the sentence. "You asked for trust before offering any explanation. I gave you that much. Now give me a reason to keep doing it." She studied my face for a long moment, searching for something I could not name. Whatever she found seemed to convince her. She lowered her voice until it was almost lost beneath the sound of the engines. "I am not running from strangers." That sentence alone shifted everything I thought I understood. "Then who are you running from?" She looked down at her wedding band finger, bare except for a faint pale line where a ring had clearly rested for a very long time. "My husband." I felt my heartbeat slow instead of quicken, as though my mind needed extra time to process the answer. She continued before I could interrupt. "Legally, we are still married. Emotionally, that marriage ended a long time ago." There was no anger in her voice, only quiet exhaustion. He built a life where every decision belonged to him, where every conversation had to happen on his terms, where leaving was treated like betrayal instead of freedom. She paused, staring through the window without really seeing the clouds. "I finally walked away 3 weeks ago." I listened without saying a word. "He has money, influence, and people who believe that loyalty can be purchased. They are not trying to hurt me. They are trying to convince me to come back before a very public divorce becomes very expensive." She gave a small, humorless smile. "It turns out disappearing is harder than people imagine." I glanced toward the front of the cabin, where one of the men sat reading a magazine that had not changed pages in nearly 20 minutes. The men on this flight work for him? Claire nodded almost imperceptibly. I think they were told to find a woman traveling alone. A happily married couple does not fit the description they expected. Suddenly, every small moment since boarding made perfect sense. The searching eyes, the careful questions, the relief that crossed her face after takeoff. Why New York? I asked. Because my attorney is there. Tomorrow morning, I sign the final documents requesting full legal separation. She reached into her purse and removed a plain white envelope, holding it carefully between both hands. Everything I need is in here. If I lose the courage to walk into that office, I lose the chance to start over. Her voice cracked ever so slightly on the last few words before she steadied herself again. I looked at the envelope, then back at Claire. For the first time since this unbelievable journey began, there were no mysteries left about why she had chosen to pretend. There was only a woman trying to reclaim her own future. Outside, another layer of clouds drifted beneath the wings, bright and endless, and I realized that somewhere between Seattle and 35,000 feet, this had stopped feeling like someone else's problem. I had boarded the airplane expecting nothing more memorable than a routine business trip. Instead, I found myself sitting beside a stranger whose entire future seemed to depend on making it safely to the arrival gate, without anyone convincing her to turn back. After Claire finished speaking, the silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. The pieces of the morning finally fit together, replacing confusion with something much heavier. She had not been looking for someone to rescue her. She had simply needed one ordinary person willing to help her remain invisible long enough to reach the next chapter of her life. I glanced down the aisle again. The men who had quietly searched the cabin earlier now looked almost relaxed. Perhaps they believed they had made a mistake. Perhaps they had already crossed Claire off their list. Either way, I had no intention of giving them another reason to look in our direction. What happens after we land? I asked. Claire gave a tired smile. I thank you, disappear into the terminal, meet my attorney, and hopefully never have to pretend again. I nodded slowly, but something about that answer did not sit right with me anymore. It sounded practical. It sounded sensible. It also sounded lonely. The captain interrupted my thoughts with an announcement that we had begun crossing into the eastern half of the country and were expected to arrive in New York a few minutes ahead of schedule. Around us, passengers stretched, ordered another round of drinks, and chatted about vacation plans and family visits. It struck me how remarkable ordinary conversations could feel after spending the past several hours inside someone else's carefully guarded secret. Claire reached into her purse again and carefully slid the plain white envelope beneath a folder of travel documents. I keep checking to make sure it is still there, she admitted with a quiet laugh, as if it might disappear. Some things become more valuable because of what they represent, I said. She looked at me thoughtfully before nodding. You understand that better than I expected. Just then the elderly couple across the aisle leaned over once more. Young man, the husband said with an easy smile. Would you mind trading seats with my wife for a few minutes? She wants to show your wife some pictures from our anniversary cruise. Before I could answer, Claire smiled warmly. I would love that. A few moments later, she was happily listening as the older woman flipped through photographs of beaches, grandchildren, and birthday celebrations. Their laughter blended naturally with the soft murmur of the cabin. Watching Claire smile, without forcing it, was strangely reassuring. For the first time since boarding, she looked less like someone escaping her past, and more like someone remembering she was allowed to enjoy the present. The older gentleman settled into the empty seat beside me. He adjusted his glasses and folded his hands comfortably. You picked a good one, he said with a knowing grin. I nearly laughed. It is a long story. The best marriages usually are. He looked toward Claire, who was laughing at another vacation picture. You know, after 40 years, I have learned something. Real partners are not the people who solve all your problems. They are the people who make you feel a little less alone while you solve them yourself. His words landed with surprising weight. Before I could respond, his wife called him back, proudly announcing she had found pictures from their wedding day. He smiled at me, patted my shoulder, and returned to his seat beside her. I watched Claire one more time as she thanked them for sharing their memories. She caught my eye across the aisle and smiled, a quiet, genuine smile that carried no performance and no hidden agenda. In that moment, I realized something had changed inside me. I was no longer helping a stranger simply because she had asked. I wanted to see her reach New York, walk into that attorney's office, and begin the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. Whatever happened after this flight, I silently promised myself that if she needed one final ally before stepping into her future, she would not have to face the arrival gate alone. The rest of the flight passed with an uneasy calm that felt almost too perfect. Outside the windows, the afternoon sun painted the clouds with soft shades of gold while the captain announced that our descent into New York would begin in about 30 minutes. Seatbacks clicked upright. Throughout the cabin, laptops disappeared into backpacks, and conversations shifted from vacation stories to baggage claims and connecting flights. Everyone seemed eager to return to ordinary life. I found myself wondering whether ordinary life would ever feel quite the same again. Claire quietly organized the papers inside her purse for what had to be the 10th time. Every document was perfectly aligned, every corner carefully straightened. It was the sort of ritual people performed when they were trying to control the only thing still within their reach. "You are checking them again," I said with a small smile. She looked down and laughed softly. "I know. I cannot seem to stop. They are still there. I hope my courage is too." There was no clever response to that. Instead, I simply nodded. Sometimes encouragement did not need impressive words. Sometimes it only needed another person willing to listen. A few minutes later, the flight attendants began collecting empty cups and reminding everyone to fasten their seat belts. As one of them reached our row, she smiled warmly at us once again. "Thank you too for making this one of the easiest cabins today," she said. "You have been wonderful passengers." Claire returned the smile with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for taking such good care of everyone." After the attendant continued down the aisle, Claire leaned toward me. "She will probably remember us as a quiet married couple." "That is not the worst legacy to leave on an airplane," I replied. She laughed, and for the first time the sound carried no trace of nervousness. The aircraft began its gradual descent, banking gently as patches of blue water and clusters of buildings appeared beneath the clouds. The New York skyline slowly emerged in the distance, shimmering beneath the afternoon light. Claire stared out the window, her eyes fixed on the city waiting below. "I used to think this skyline looked intimidating," she whispered. "Today it looks like freedom." I followed her gaze. Thousands of buildings stretched toward the horizon, each one holding countless stories. Somehow ours had started 35,000 feet above them all. As the landing gear lowered with a familiar mechanical rumble, I noticed movement several rows ahead. One of the men stood briefly to retrieve a jacket from the overhead compartment before sitting back down without looking in our direction. Claire noticed him too, but this time she did not tense. Instead, she took a slow breath and gently rested her hands in her lap. "I think they believe their search is over," she said. "Then let us keep it that way." The wheels touched the runway with a firm but smooth bump, followed by the roar of reverse thrust as the airplane slowed. A wave of quiet applause rose from several passengers, earning amused smiles throughout the cabin. The elderly couple across the aisle exchanged another affectionate glance. The little boy cheered because he had counted the seconds until landing correctly. Ordinary moments returned one after another, gently replacing the tension that had filled the flight. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Claire turned toward me with an expression I had not seen before. It was neither fear nor relief. It was determination. "When those doors open," she said softly, "everything changes." I looked toward the front of the cabin where the jet bridge was already approaching the aircraft. Then I looked back at Claire and realized that although our pretend marriage was about to end, the choice standing before both of us was completely real. We could walk away as strangers whose paths had briefly crossed in the sky, or we could take one more step together into whatever waited beyond the arrival gate. The seatbelt sign switched off with a soft chime, and almost instantly the entire cabin came alive. Overhead bins opened, phones reconnected to the world, and passengers stood shoulder to shoulder in the narrow aisle with the familiar impatience of people convinced that standing sooner somehow meant leaving sooner. Claire remained seated beside me, her hands folded calmly over her purse. For someone who had spent the entire flight carrying the weight of uncertainty, she suddenly looked remarkably steady. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing a complete stranger." I smiled. "You stopped being a complete stranger somewhere over the Rockies." She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that no longer sounded borrowed. When our row finally began moving, we stepped into the aisle together. Without discussing it, we walked side by side exactly as we had throughout the flight, close enough that anyone watching would still assume we were husband and wife. The elderly couple waved goodbye as they passed us. "Take good care of each other," the older woman said warmly. Claire's eyes glistened for just a moment before she answered, "We will. Thank you." We stepped into the jet bridge with the slow stream of travelers. Bright afternoon lights spilled through the terminal windows ahead, and for the first time since boarding, I noticed Claire lift her chin instead of looking over her shoulder. Whatever waited beyond those doors, she intended to face it. Inside the terminal, the crowd naturally divided toward baggage claim, connecting flights, and ground transportation. The three men who had quietly searched the cabin earlier walked ahead, without so much as a glance in our direction before disappearing into another corridor. Claire watched them leave, then released a long breath that seemed to carry away weeks of tension. "It is over," she whispered, almost as if she did not quite believe it herself. We continued walking until we reached a quieter corner near a wall of tall windows overlooking the runways. Airplanes taxied beneath the late afternoon sun, while travelers hurried past with rolling suitcases and coffee cups. Life continued exactly as it had before our flight, yet everything felt different. Claire carefully removed the plain white envelope from her purse and held it against her chest. "My attorney's office is 15 minutes from here," she said. "I can do the rest on my own." I nodded, although part of me wished the conversation did not have to end. She reached into her purse one final time and took out the small printed photograph the elderly woman had insisted on taking during the flight. Somehow, she had already asked the woman to send it using the airport wireless network before landing. The picture showed two people standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling naturally at a camera despite having met only hours earlier. Claire looked at it for several seconds before handing it to me. "Keep it," she said. "Not because we were pretending. Because someone reminded me what kindness looks like when it expects nothing in return." I accepted the photograph, suddenly realizing it might become one of the most meaningful souvenirs I had ever received. "Will I ever see you again?" I asked. She smiled, thoughtful rather than uncertain. "I hope so. But this time I would like us to meet without fear, without pretending, and without looking over my shoulder every few minutes." She extended her hand. Instead of shaking it, I gently opened the airport map on my phone. "You said your attorney is 15 minutes away." She nodded. "Then let me walk with you until the front door. Not because you need someone to save you. Because everyone deserves company at the beginning of a new chapter." For a brief second, she simply looked at me, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude. Then she smiled wider than I had seen all day. Together we stepped toward the terminal exit, leaving behind the imaginary marriage that had carried us across the country and walking into a future where, for the first time, neither of us had to pretend to be anyone other than ourselves.